Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on habits, those things we do every day without even thinking about it. We're cracking open Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit, to see how they really work, like how they shape our lives, businesses, and even whole societies.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. You might be surprised to learn just how much of your day is actually run by these unconscious patterns.
So anyone listening who hasn't gotten around to reading Duhigg's book yet, can you give us the quick and dirty on what this habit loop is all about?
Well, it's kind of like a feedback loop happening in your brain.
Yeah.
It always starts with a cue, some kind of trigger that gets the whole thing going. And then comes the routine. That's the actual behavior you do. And then the last part is the reward. And that's the good feeling that tells your brain, hey, do that again.
Right. And Duhigg talks about this guy, Eugene Pauly, who lost his memory but could still learn new habits.
Oh, yeah. Eugene Pauly is a really good example.
Yeah, it just shows how automatic this habit loop is. Like, it's happening even when we don't remember why we do things.
Exactly. Eugene's case shows how our brains can repeat behaviors based on those cues and rewards, even when we don't consciously remember why we're doing them.
So someone listening right now, let's say they're trying to break a bad habit. What would you tell them? Like, what's the big takeaway from Eugene's story?
You got to be aware of your own habit loops. Even if you don't fully understand the why, you can start by noticing your cues and rewards. That's the first step to taking back control.
And speaking of rewards, Duhigg goes into a lot of detail about cravings. I thought that story about Pepsodent toothpaste was so interesting, how it wasn't really about clean teeth at all.
Oh yeah, Claude Hopkins. He was the guy behind Pepsodent. He was a marketing whiz. He understood that to sell something, you have to make people crave it.
So it wasn't about dental health.
No, not really. He made people want that tingling feeling even if it didn't actually clean their teeth better.
It's kind of sneaky, right?
Yeah, it's everywhere though, especially with food. It makes you think, how much of what we crave is really just clever marketing? Like, are we actually hungry or just reacting to some ad?
That's a really good point. So how do we know the difference?
That's where understanding this habit loop is so important. If you can recognize what triggers your cravings, like, seeing a yummy food ad or walking past your favorite bakery, you can start to think, is this real hunger or am I just reacting to something?
Okay, so let's say we want to change a habit. I was really interested in what Duhigg called the golden rule of habit change.
Oh yeah, the golden rule. It's pretty straightforward, actually. You keep the same cue and reward, but you change the routine. You're not fighting the whole loop, you're just redirecting it.
Like a detour.
Exactly. Like a detour for your brain.
He uses the example of Tony Dungy, right? The football coach.
Oh yeah, Tony Duhigg. He managed to turn around a losing team just by changing their smallest habits. It's pretty amazing.
But he didn't try to overhaul everything at once.
Nope. Dungy realized that even tiny changes, if you do them over and over, can lead to big improvements. So it's not about making huge, drastic changes. It's about finding those small changes to your routine that can make a difference.
I've definitely been guilty of trying to change too much at once instead of focusing on one specific routine. Any tips for our listeners who are trying to do the same thing?
Pick one habit you want to change and really break it down. What's the cue? What's the reward? Then think about some other routines that could give you a similar reward. Like, instead of scrolling on your phone before bed, maybe try reading a book or listening to calming music. The key is to try different things and see what works for you.
That makes sense. So Duhigg also talks about these things called keystone habits. They're habits that seem to have a ripple effect on other parts of our lives.
Yeah, like imagine the cornerstone of a building. Keystone habits are like they're the foundation for big changes.
So they have this domino effect.
Exactly. Like Paul O'Neill, for example. He was the CEO of Alcoa.
Oh, yeah, I remember that story.
He decided to focus on worker safety. It seemed like a small thing, but it ended up leading to massive improvements in communication efficiency and the company's overall success.
It's crazy how something so specific can unlock so much change.
And the cool thing is that anyone can use this idea. You don't have to be a CEO or anything. Just look at your own life and think, what's one habit that if I changed could have a big impact on other things? Maybe it's exercising in the morning, or maybe it's learning a new skill for 30 minutes a day.
I like that. It's not just about the habit itself. It's about how it can trigger other positive changes in your life.
Exactly. And, it gets even more interesting because on top of the habit loop itself, there's another crucial ingredient for change, and that's belief.
You're right. Belief is huge. In the book, Duhigg talks about AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and how the power of belief and having a support system can help people overcome addiction.
Yeah, A is fascinating. They don't just focus on quitting drinking. They help people change all those habits and routines that go along with it.
Yeah.
And being part of a group, people who get it and support you, that can be really powerful for change.
It's like finding your people, the ones who are on the same journey and can keep you going.
Exactly. But Duhigg doesn't stop there. He takes it even further into the brain. You know how habits work on a neurological level and the whole question of free will? He even talks about this case where a man killed his wife in his sleep, which makes you wonder how much control we really have.
That's kind of scary. Like,
Yeah.
if our brains can just run on autopilot like that, how do we know if we're actually making choices?
It's a really complicated issue. But the good news is that understanding this habit loop can actually give us more control. Once you see those cues and rewards, you can choose to do something different.
So instead of feeling stuck with our habits, we can learn to use the habit loop to our advantage.
That's the idea. And that's where Duhigg's message of the will to believe comes in. He talks about William James, this philosopher who got over depression by acting as if he had free will. It's like rewiring your brain by choosing to believe in your power to change.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe you can change, you're more likely to actually make it happen.
Yeah. Duhigg encourages people to have a growth mindset that you're always changing and learning and adapting. It's not about being perfect. It's about embracing change and seeing yourself as someone who can break those old patterns and build new ones.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, what are some things they can do to start using the power of belief in their own lives?
One thing you can do is surround yourself with people who support you, who believe in you. Think about your goals and who are those people in your life who lift you up and encourage you.
It's true. It's so draining to be around people who are negative or always doubting you. It makes a huge difference to have people who support you.
It's like having your own cheerleading squad reminding you that you can do it.
And you know, Duhigg doesn't just talk about personal habits. He also looks at how companies use data to predict and even manipulate our habits. It's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, he talks about Target, how they can analyze what we buy to figure out things like if we're pregnant even before we know it ourselves. It's a good example of how much information can be pulled from those little everyday things we do.
It's kind of creepy, right? Like they're predicting the future with our shopping carts. Is it ethical to use data like that?
Yeah, it definitely brings up questions about privacy and control over our own data. But it also shows why it's so important to be aware of these tactics. The more you understand how companies try to influence you, the better you can make your own choices.
So how can we protect ourselves from those data-driven marketing strategies?
Well, being careful about what you share online is a good start. Pay attention to those privacy settings on your social media and be picky about who you give your information to.
And to be fair, those data strategies aren't always bad, right? Sometimes it can make our lives easier with recommendations and stuff. It's about finding the right balance.
Right. And speaking of influence, Duhigg talks about this technique called sandwiching.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. It's like making something new or different seem more appealing by putting it next to things that are already familiar and well-liked. Like how radio stations used it to make Outkast's Hey Ya popular.
Yeah, exactly. That song was so unique, it might not have taken off if they hadn't put it between other popular hits. By sandwiching it, they made it feel more familiar and easy to listen to.
It's like hiding a healthy vegetable between two slices of pizza.
Right. You don't even realize you're eating something good for you.
And they use this sandwiching everywhere, like in movies with product placement and in commercials during TV shows. It's all about shaping how we see things and nudging us towards certain choices. Okay, so how can we become more aware of this subtle influence? What should we be looking for?
One thing to watch out for is when you feel overwhelmed with too many choices. If you're constantly bombarded with options, it can be tough to make a decision. Take a step back and think, do I really want this, or am I just reacting to some clever marketing?
It's about taking back control, reminding ourselves we do have the power to choose, even when it feels like we're being pulled in a million different directions.
Yeah.
And speaking of collective action, Duhigg also talks about how social movements create widespread change.
Yeah, he uses the Montgomery bus boycott as an example, how collective action and a shared belief system can overcome those deep-seated social norms. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow process of building momentum and finding a common purpose.
It's incredible how Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat started such a huge movement. It really shows how one person can spark change.
And the boycott wouldn't have been so successful without Martin Luther King Jr. He understood how social habits work and how to create new behaviors to keep the movement going. His focus on nonviolence and peaceful resistance created a set of shared habits that helped individuals take ownership of the movement.
It's a great example of how social habits can be used for good to create positive change on a large scale. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the power of habits, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
Even the most ingrained habits, whether they're personal or societal, can be changed. It takes time and effort and belief. But as we've seen from Duhigg's book, the power to transform our lives and our world really is within each of us.
It's really inspiring to think about all that potential we have, to make positive changes both for ourselves and for the world. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the power of habit, what's one thing our listeners can do today to start putting these ideas into practice?
Well, I'd say start small. Pick one tiny habit you want to change and really focus on it. Remember the golden rule, keep the cue and the reward, but try a different routine. And don't be afraid to ask for help. Tell a friend about your goal or join a group of people who are working on similar things.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think it's important to remember that change doesn't happen right away. There will be times when you slip up. The important thing is to be kind to yourself, learn from those mistakes, and keep going.
I agree. Building new habits takes time and effort, but it's so worth it. Just imagine how good it will feel to finally break that bad habit that's been holding you back, or the sense of accomplishment when you successfully make that positive change in your life.
It's like you unlock a whole new level of control and confidence. And like we talked about with Duhigg, it's not just about individual change. Understanding the power of habit can help us create positive change in our communities and even on a global scale.
Yeah, think about those movements we discussed, like the Montgomery bus boycott. It all started with individuals making a choice to change their habits. And those individual actions, when they spread through a community, they created a ripple effect that led to real, lasting change.
It's a good reminder that we all have a part to play. Even small changes can make a big difference. So as we leave our listeners with this final thought, I'm curious, what's one small habit change you're committed to making?
Well, lately I've been trying to be more aware of my screen time, especially in the evenings. Instead of scrolling on my phone before bed, I started reading a book or listening to calming music. It's amazing how much better I sleep when I disconnect from technology for an hour or two before bed.
That's great. And for me, I'm trying to be more intentional about my mornings. Instead of hitting the snooze button and rushing out the door, I'm setting my alarm a little earlier so I can have a few minutes to meditate and have a cup of coffee before the day starts. It's made a big difference in my focus and productivity.
I like that. It's all about those little victories that build up over time.
Exactly. So to our listeners, we challenge you to join us. What's one small habit change you can commit to today, knowing the power it has?
Let us know how it goes.
That's all for this deep dive into the power of habit. We hope you enjoyed it and learned some new things about yourself and the things that shape our lives.
Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep.